You're watching World Insight with me, Tian. Among the victims of conflicts and war, it is children who pay the highest price. About 9 in 10 of Gaza's population are estimated to have been displaced, half of them children. And over 4.6 million children from Sudan have fled their homes since April 2023, the world's largest child displacement. Children in conflicted areas are deprived of their rights and denied humanitarian assistance. Yet Chaiban, United Nations Assistant Secretary General, UNICEF Deputy Executive Director, believes that change is possible. As someone of extensive experience in humanitarian work, Chaiban sees the progress that has been achieved up until now, and he told me about it in our earlier conversation when he visited Beijing. Ted, so good to see you in Beijing.
Thank you, Wei. It's a pleasure to be here.
What do you think is the most important messages you want to communicate during your trip this time?
Look, I think what's really important is we're facing a world with many global problems, whether it's the aftermath of COVID, the multitude of conflicts out there, the impact of climate change, which is impacting all of us. And we can only address those issues through international cooperation. And China has issues it's dealing with internally, but also it has a place in the world. And it's a real pleasure to be here to be able to discuss both how UNICEF can cooperate with China inside China, but also how we can cooperate internationally.
I really do not know how people like you would have to overcome in order to function professionally in a very fragmented world compared to, let's just say, 10 years ago. After all, you travel to the most controversial areas of the world. You deal with crises, conflicts, wars. You see the most needed in help. So what does that take?
So firstly, I remind myself that change is possible. Despite the world we're in, the reality is that we have more children that are educated today, that we've just gone through a child survival revolution where mortality has gone down by 75% globally. And so we always have to remind ourselves that progress is positive. And yet the reality is that we are dealing with polycrises. We've got the overhang of COVID with the impact both on inflation but also on supply chain. We've got an explosion of conflict. Last year, UNICEF responded to 412 crises globally. You've got 1 in 5 children either living in or fleeing conflict areas. And you've got 1 billion children that are at risk because of climate change or climate-related disasters. So we're really looking at a world which is in turmoil. And what we need to do in that world is firstly focus on what we can do together. How can we line up and cooperate to try to address the most essential needs of children and their families? And there are very cost-effective interventions, a very strong focus, for example, on primary healthcare, even in conflict settings. For every 1 RMB invested, you have a 26 RMB return on investment when it comes to vaccinations, for example. Second, we need to continue to advocate to address the underlying causes. So both in terms of the conflicts that exist, we need a ceasefire in Gaza now. We cannot allow Sudan to become the Somalia of the 21st century. We need to continue to work with different governments and other constituents to try to address the underlying causes of some of these conflicts. Mm-hmm. And of course, the whole agenda around climate change. There needs to be a focus on a sustainable way of living. And for us as UNICEF, it's really the place of children and young people in a movement for climate change. And the role of education in addressing climate change. How can we make sure that we respond to the clarion call of the new generation, which is that this is our planet. We are going to inherit the world you gave us, and therefore we all need to be living sustainably.
You just traveled back to Gaza. Actually, it's already your many times trips there. Tell us what you have observed there, and also the immediate and the most important challenges and tasks of children's welfare there.
Look, I've been around in this business a long time. I've gone all over the world. I'm in my early 60s. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've rarely seen a situation as devastating as Gaza. 14,000 children have been reportedly killed in the Gaza Strip. Of the total mortality in Gaza, some 70% is women and children. The population in Gaza is 2.2 million people. 1.9 million of those 2.2 million people have been displaced. And the infrastructure is devastated. It's heart-wrenching to see what has happened to the population. What happened on October 7th was horrible. It was horrendous. And what's happened every single day since October 7th has been horrible and horrendous, and it needs to stop. We need a ceasefire. The challenges are enormous, starting with access. We need to be able to access the population throughout the whole of the Gaza Strip. We need multiple access points, not just Kerem Shalom and Rafah on the border with Egypt, but we need Zikim and Eretz and the points in the north of the Gaza Strip to be open. We need to be able to have security within the Strip. If there's no law and order within the Strip, you can't deliver humanitarian assistance. We need so-called dual-use supplies to be allowed. So, water pipes, water fittings, which for a while have not been allowed into the Strip. There's been some improvement, but we need to make sure that those kind of supplies that are needed to address the sanitation situation are dealt with. We have a society that was, before October 7th, a middle-class society that now is dealing with hunger and famine. This is happening on our watch.
For such a seasoned negotiator as you, I'm sure you have pushed these points already to the extreme, the extent that you can. Why they failed?
Look, some of these issues are long-standing political problems. The situation in Gaza, the situation in Palestine, Israel did not start on October 7th. No. People thought that you could ignore the situation. Israel might make political agreements with Arab countries and not deal with the Palestinian question and the Palestinian people that are also living right there on that territory. And that's not possible. You need to find a way that we secure a future where Israeli and Palestinian children have their rights respected, and that requires movement on a political front towards a two-state solution. When the Security Council is divided on such matters, it's very difficult to make progress. Now, we have to do everything possible so that out of this tragedy, if there is something that can come out of this tragedy, both for Israeli and Palestinian children, that there's a political process that puts a two-state solution back on track, right, so that we can find a way forward.
So the other thing that many are talking about is the supply chain disruptions. We have seen the world more fragmented, not only geopolitics, but also other factors. So how do you, when you are working and try to secure your supplies for the children, work with the realities?
So one of the reasons why we're in China is to see how much more can be procured out of China to support humanitarian responses globally. UNICEF is one of the largest suppliers of different goods, whether for humanitarian or development actions globally. We globally procure about $5.2 billion of commodities, including almost all of the vaccines that we work on with the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative and WHO. Out of that $5.2 billion, roughly $200 to $230 million is procured in China directly. Mm-hmm. There are, of course, goods produced in China that are procured elsewhere in the world. And so we're trying to see how we can get more efficient direct access to more suppliers that are qualified to provide the goods that are needed. And we do this in different markets for efficiency purposes. But the other thing we're looking at also is how can we increase the decentralization of manufacture and getting more variety of manufacturing for key goods. What COVID showed us, the COVID-19 crisis showed us, is that we have an unequal distribution of the means of manufacturing. There's too few companies in too few countries that are manufacturing vaccines, but also syringes, personal protective equipment. And what we need to do is encourage production in different parts of the world. UNICEF has signed an agreement with the Africa CDC. And what we're hoping to do is to encourage production in Africa of different medical countermeasures. And we're looking also to work with the China CDC in this regard, because we don't want a world in the future, the next time we have a pandemic, where some people have access to medical countermeasures and the others don't. And the key word there is localization. The more we can produce locally, not only is it makes sense from the point of view of a secure pipeline, but it also is more sustainable. It reduces the carbon footprint of securing the supplies.
People tend to look more inward rather than outward. So in current circumstances, how would you be able to attract partners around the world to support your cause, which is one of the most important in the world, one could argue, for children, when resources is limited, when rhetorics are going in very different directions? What are the daily ways you are trying to deal with realities like this?
So, firstly, let me start by saying you're absolutely correct.
I hope I was wrong, but unfortunately.
You're absolutely correct. 20 years ago, when I worked in Sudan during the first Darfur crisis, we were able to mobilize a sense of outrage against what was going on in Darfur. This time, almost the very same thing is happening, and there's barely a word, barely any kind of attention to that crisis. It's a lot harder now to get that kind of global solidarity, that kind of global movement around a certain issue. At the same time, here we are 5 years away from the end of the SDGs. Only a bit less than 20% of the SDG targets are on track. For children, 2/3 of the indicators are off track. So what we are calling for is to focus on what can be the most effective interventions to move forward, to try to build coalitions so that we can have inflection points towards achieving a greater share of the indicators or getting as close to possible as that. So it's starting from that shared humanity, that shared interest, and working outwards from that. And even when we speak about the set of values or policies that different member states have, you will find a fair bit of overlap. And again, how can you use that to be able to move outwards?
I would love to hear your thoughts about how, from where you are, see the changes of China and see the perception of changes about China, and how do they impact your work?
Let me start by saying, firstly, that China has made enormous progress on child rights. Firstly, in 2021, China eradicated absolute poverty. 100 million people living in rural settings were lifted out of poverty in less than a decade. China has achieved its mortality, its neonatal and under 5 mortality targets. As we said before, universal coverage of basic compulsory education, huge progress made. And I like to say that UNICEF's been part of that story, a little part of the story, but we've been part of that story. We've been here for 40 years, so we've been part of this movement and this development. And yet at the same
You
time,
have been recognized by many Chinese stakeholders as important partners. So
Thank you.
congratulations.
Thank you. That's very appreciated. That's what we do domestically. In the world, we have a strong cooperation with China. In the last few years, around $26 million worth of programs that we've done globally, covering 20 countries and in Asia and Africa, reaching 15 million children and their families. And there, it's been a varied portfolio of work. And it's not only about money, it's about how can we work together on certain ideas, certain innovation that China is strong at and that could be beneficial to other parts of the world.
Ted, what a pleasure seeing you. Thank you so much for your work.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having interviewed me.